Hi friends, welcome back. I'm Christina, the manager at the Pacific Beach Library. Thank you for joining me for day 18 of our read along together of Emma by Jane Austen. We've got a long reading today, so I'll try not to talk too much, but that never works out. Let's see. Today's tea is one that I already poured out. I usually go home for lunch, and today at lunch I made a pot of, I think it's called Sugar Plum Fairy or Sugar Plum something. It was one of the holiday tea line that Celestial Seasonings put out this year. Hello. And I made myself a big thermos of it to bring back, and I hadn't gotten far with it. And so when it was getting ready for our tea time today, I was like, I'm just gonna pour out and drink the tea that I already made. This one has a really nice day. Hello, yeah, or a really nice scent to it. I want to say it's cloves, but I'm not 100% sure. And yes, this is the perfect day for tea. Whenever it's like cold and gray outside, I just like to snuggle up with a good book and a nice warm drink. And so preferably tea. So I hope y'all are enjoying something wonderful. If you'd like to comment as to what you're enjoying today, that would be fun. It's nice to, it feels more like we're sharing our tea together then. That is so good. Okay, and so let's talk a little bit about our reading. Oh, before that, I was gonna let you know too, I did end up finally creating the calendar event for our film screening. Yay! There's a few changes from what I initially thought it was going to be. Instead of us all watching it together, it turns out that you can watch it anytime between like 3 o'clock and midnight. And so I'll go ahead and post a link to the calendar listing. I've also created a couple little extra events if anyone wants to, like for example, I feel like it's like the Super Bowl, like a pre-game party. Like we can do a pre-screening little tea party if anyone wants to, right before the window opens to watch the film on Saturday the 13th. And I was thinking also our discussion that we do at the conclusion of Emma, instead of just being about the book, we can have it be the book and the film. So I'll post information about all of those events. I'll post those later today. Okay, so let's talk about what we read yesterday. Yesterday we just read 2 short chapters. Today we're going to read 2 chapters, but a little longer. In chapter 4 of volume 3, which is also known as chapter 40, yesterday it started out with Harriet Smith coming up to Emma and saying, I'm getting rid of all the mementos that I had of Mr. Elton. I no longer fancy him. He was really horrible to her. Ooh, I love Bengal Spice. Sorry, I just saw that Pam was drinking that. That's one of my favorites too. It has that nice spicy flavor to it, yeah. So Emma and Harriet have this discussion, and Harriet basically burns in the fire these really kind of sad little mementos of her infatuation with Mr. Elton. And in a way, it speaks to how not close they actually were, how much of this romance that she had created in her own mind with Emma's help, and at Emma's urging, to be quite honest, but how little foundation there was for her feelings for Mr. Elton. And so as she burns these treasures, which are really insignificant, it just shows how little there was to that relationship. And Emma sort of says, I think that we don't really need to discuss it, and I'm not going to push for it because you know what happened the last time I tried to interfere, and of course I'm not matchmaking anymore. Right. And she says, but I think that it seems like maybe you are finally able to let go of the dream of Mr. Elton because now your feelings might be engaged elsewhere. And Harriet says, yes, there was somebody else who showed her, like what a true gentleman was, and somebody who provided aid to her that she had been so sad and so unhappy and so, emotional. And then this person, his infinite superiority to all the rest of the world, she can see him with gratitude, wonder, and veneration, which are so proper in me especially. And so Emma is all convinced that Harriet is talking about Mr. Frank Churchill because he rescued her from the gypsies. And so she's like, well, I'm not going to say anything about it. Oh no, I see that Judy's not getting video. Can anyone else confirm if they still have video? It looks to me like there are some viewers here, so I'm not certain. I'll keep talking for now, but if somebody could please confirm if you can see this, that would be wonderful. Or if not, I'll start over. All right, I'm going to keep going for now. And so Harriet and Emma, they never say the name of who it is, but Emma is convinced that Harriet is now in love with Mr. Frank Churchill. Okay. Well, Melissa's just confirmed we do have some video working. So Judy, maybe try again. Just log off and come right back on. I hope it'll work. Okay, I'm just going to keep going because we have a long reading today and I don't want to fall behind. In the second chapter that we read yesterday, let's see. basically, there was an interesting bit where Mr. Frank Churchill was talking about some gossip that he'd heard, and he says to Mrs. Weston, like, didn't you tell me about this? And she's like, no, I don't know what you're talking about. And then later on, Miss Bates says, why, I mean, maybe you did, because he says, I must have had a dream about it. And Miss Bates says, wow, we were gossiping about that. She didn't say gossiping, but she's like, basically, they were gossiping about it in her household. And she says that, you know, she had tried her best not to tell other people, but sometimes she can't help it. She hints. She's a talker, and she knows it. And so there's a bit of speculation or wondering of there, some hints drop that maybe Frank Churchill has some other source or correspondent other than Mrs. Weston. In fact, Mr. Knightley, as he's observing that interaction, he goes so far as to suspect that maybe there's something going on between Jane Fairfax and Mr. Frank Churchill. And so he is, in fact, more and more upset by the behavior of Frank Churchill, because it seems to him that Frank Churchill is flirting both with Jane Fairfax and with Emma Woodhouse. And, you know, especially as an old family friend, as perhaps, you know, almost like a brother. He's the brother-in-law of her sister, that it concerns him that Frank Churchill might basically be two-timing like that. Oh, ooh, sorry. I just saw it's Girls' Day today. I didn't realize that. Yay. Let's all raise our glasses. Yummy. And so, okay, so Mr. Knightley actually brings up the suspicion to Emma. He broaches it to her that perhaps she doesn't quite understand what's going on between Frank Churchill and Emma. And Emma's like, or sorry, between Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax. And Emma's like, no, you don't quite understand, because they've been teasing a little bit about the Dixons and that possibility of Jane Fairfax having having a little bit of feeling still for Mr. Dixon. And so she's like, no, you don't understand what's going on. There's nothing between those two. And in fact, Emma's thinking to herself that it can't also be because, one, he probably had feelings for Emma herself, but also that maybe there's a small chance, maybe there could be something on the horizon with him and Harriet Smith, but Jane Fairfax, absolutely not. And so Emma's very dismissive of that suggestion. And so Mr. Knightley, of course, is quite concerned. And the chapter ended with Mr. Knightley walking home alone. All right, today we have two chapters. Chapters 42 and 43 of our book, or chapters 6 and 7 of volume 3. Let's go on in. After being long fed with hopes of a speedy visit from Mr. and Mrs. Suckling, the Highbury world were obliged to endure the mortification of hearing that they could not possibly come till the autumn. No such importation of novelties could enrich their intellectual stores at present. In the daily interchange of news, they must be again restricted to the other topics with which for a while the Sucklings' coming had been united, such as the last accounts of Mrs. Churchill, whose health seemed every day to supply a different report, and the situation of Mrs. Weston, whose happiness it was to be hoped might eventually be as much increased by the arrival of a child as that of all her neighbors was by the approach of it. Mrs. Elton was very much disappointed. It was the delay of a great deal of pleasure and parade. Her introductions and recommendations must all wait, and every projected party be still only talked of. So she thought at first. But a little consideration convinced her that everything need not be put off. Why should not they explore to Box Hill, though the Sucklings did not come? They could go there again with them in the autumn. It was settled that they should go to Box Hill. That there was to be such a party had been long generally known. It had even given the idea of another. Emma had never been to Box Hill. She wished to see what everybody found so well worth visiting, and she and Mr. Weston had agreed to choose some fine morning and drive thither. 2 or 3 more of the chosen only were to be admitted to join them, and it was to be done in a quiet, unpretending, elegant way, infinitely superior to the bustle and preparation, the regular eating and drinking and picnic parade of the Eltons and the Sucklings. This was so very well understood between them that Emma could not but feel some surprise and a little displeasure on hearing from Mr. Weston that he had been proposing to Mrs. Elton, as her brother and sister had failed her, that the two parties should unite and go together, and that as Mrs. Elton had very readily acceded to it, so it was to be, if she had no objection. Now, as her objection was nothing but her very great dislike of Mrs. Elton, of which Mr. Elton must already be perfectly aware, it was not worth bringing forward again. It could not be done without a reproof to him, which would be giving pain to his wife, and she found herself therefore obliged to consent to an arrangement which she would have done a great deal to avoid, an arrangement which would probably expose her even to the degradation of being said to be of Mrs. Elton's party. Ugh. Every feeling was offended, and the forbearance of her outward submission left a heavy arrear due of secret severity in her reflections on the unmanageable goodwill of Mr. Weston's temper. "I am glad you approve of what I have done," said he very comfortably, "but I thought you would. Such schemes as these are nothing without numbers. One cannot have too large a party. A large party secures its own amusement, and she is a good-natured woman after all. One could not leave her out." Emma denied none of it aloud, and agreed to none of it in private. It was now the middle of June, and the weather fine, and Mrs. Elton was growing impatient to name the day and settle with Mr. Weston as to pigeon pies and cold lamb, when a lame carriage horse threw everything into sad uncertainty. It might be weeks, it might be only a few days before the horse were usable, but no preparations could be ventured on, and it was all melancholy stagnation. Mrs. Elton's resources were inadequate to such an attack. "Is not this most vexatious, Knightley?" she cried, "and such weather for exploring? These delays and disappointments are quite odious. What are we to do? The year will wear away at this rate, and nothing done. Before this time last year, I assure you, we had a delightful exploring party from Maple Grove to King's Weston." "You had better explore to Donwell," replied Mr. Knightley. "That may be done without horses. Come and eat my strawberries. They are ripening fast." If Mr. Knightley did not begin seriously, he was obliged to proceed so, for his proposal was caught at with delight, and the "Oh, I should like it of all things" was not plainer in words than manner. Donwell was famous for its strawberry beds, which seemed a plea for the invitation. But no plea was necessary. Cabbage beds would have been enough to tempt the lady, who only wanted to be going somewhere. She promised him again and again to come, much oftener than he doubted, and was extremely gratified by such a proof of intimacy, such a distinguishing compliment as she chose to consider it. You may depend upon me," said she. "I certainly will come. Name your day, and I will come. You will allow me to bring Jane Fairfax?" "I cannot name a day," said he, "till I have spoken to some others whom I would wish to meet you." "Oh, leave all that to me. Only give me a carte blanche. I am Lady Patroness, you know. It is my party. I will bring friends with me." "I hope you will bring Elton," said he, "but I will not trouble you to give any other invitations." "Oh, now you are looking very sly. But consider, you need not be afraid of delegating power to me. I am no young lady on her preferment. Married women, you know, may be safely authorized. It is my party. Leave it all to me. I will invite your guests." "No," he calmly replied. "There is but one married woman in the world whom I can ever allow to invite what guests she pleases to Donwell, and that one is—" "Mrs. Weston, I suppose," interrupted Mrs. Elton, rather mortified. "No, Mrs. Knightley. And till she is in being, I will manage such matters myself." "Ah, you are an odd creature," she cried, satisfied to have no one preferred to herself. "You are a humorist, and may say what you like. Quite a humorist. Well, I shall bring Jane with me. Jane and her aunt. The rest I leave to you. I have no objections at all to meeting the Hartfield family. Don't scruple. I know you are attached to them." "You certainly will meet them if I can prevail, and I shall call on Miss Bates in my way home." "That's quite unnecessary. I see Jane every day. But as you like. It is to be a morning scheme, you know, Knightley. Quite a simple thing. I shall wear a large bonnet and bring one of my little baskets hanging on my arm. Here, probably this basket with pink ribbon. Nothing can be more simple, you see. And Jane will have such another. There is to be no form or parade, a sort of gypsy party. We are to walk about your gardens and gather the strawberries ourselves and sit under trees and whatever else you may like to provide. It is to be all out of doors, a table spread in the shade, you know. Everything as natural and simple as possible. Is not that your idea? Not quite. My idea of the simple and the natural will be to have the table spread in the dining room. The nature and the simplicity of gentlemen and ladies, with their servants and furniture, I think is best observed by meals within doors. When you are tired of eating strawberries in the garden, there shall be cold meat in the house. Well, as you please. Only don't have a great set out. And, by the by, can I or my housekeeper be of any use to you with our opinion? Pray be sincere, Knightley. If you wish me to talk to Mrs. Hodges or to inspect anything, I have not the least wish for it, I thank you. Well, but if any difficulties should arise, my housekeeper is extremely clever. I will answer for it that mine thinks herself full as clever and would spurn anybody's assistance. I wish we had a donkey. The thing would be for all of us to come on donkeys, Jane, Miss Bates, and me, and my caro sposo walking by. I really must talk to him about purchasing a donkey. In a country life, I conceive it to be a sort of necessary. For, let a woman have ever so many resources, it is not possible for her to be always shut up at home. And very long walks, you know. In summer there is dust, and in winter there is dirt. You will not find either between Donwell and Highbury. Donwell Lane is never dusty, and now it is perfectly dry. Come on a donkey, however, if you prefer it. You can borrow Mrs. Cole's. I would wish everything to be as much to your taste as possible. That I am sure you would. Indeed, I do you justice, my good friend. Under that peculiar sort of dry, blunt manner, I know you have the warmest heart. As I tell Mr. E, you are a thorough humorist. Yes, believe me, Knightley, I am fully sensible of your attention to me in the whole of this scheme. You have hit upon the very thing to please me. Mr. Knightley had another reason for avoiding a table in the shade. He wished to persuade Mr. Woodhouse, as well as Emma, to join the party, and he knew that to have any of them sitting down out of doors to eat would inevitably make him ill. Mr. Woodhouse must not, under the specious pretense of a morning drive and an hour or two spent at Donwell, be tempted away to his misery. He was invited on good faith. No lurking horrors were to upbraid him for his easy credulity. He did consent. He had not been at Donwell for 2 years. Some very fine morning he and Emma and Harriet could go very well, and he could sit still with Mrs. Weston while the dear girls walked about the gardens. He did not suppose they could be damp now in the middle of the day. He should like to see the old house again exceedingly, and should be very happy to meet Mr. and Mrs. Elton and any other of his neighbors. He could not see any objection at all to his and Emma's and Harriet's going there some very fine morning. He thought it very well done of Mr. Knightley to invite them, very kind and sensible, much cleverer than dining out. He was not fond of dining out. Mr. Knightley was fortunate in everybody's most ready concurrence. The invitation was everywhere so well received that it seemed as if, like Mrs. Elton, they were all taking the scheme as a particular compliment to themselves. Emma and Harriet professed very high expectations of pleasure from it, and Mr. Weston, unasked, promised to get Frank over to join them if possible, a proof of approbation and gratitude which could have been dispensed with. Mr. Knightley was then obliged to say that he should be glad to see him, and Mr. Weston engaged to lose no time in writing and spare no arguments to induce him to come. In the meanwhile, the lame horse recovered so fast that the party to Box Hill was again under happy consideration, and at last Donwell was settled for one day and Box Hill for the next, the weather appearing exactly right. Under a bright midday sun at almost midsummer, Mr. Woodhouse was safely conveyed in his carriage, with one window down, to partake of this alfresco party, and in one of the most comfortable rooms in the Abbey, especially prepared for him by a fire all the morning, he was happily placed, quite at his ease, ready to talk with pleasure of what had been achieved, and advise everybody to come and sit down and not to heat themselves. Mrs. Weston, who seemed to have walked there on purpose to be tired and sit all the time with him, remained, when all the others were invited or persuaded out, his patient listener and sympathizer. It was so long since Emma had been at the Abbey that as soon as she was satisfied of her father's comfort, she was glad to leave him and look around her, eager to refresh and correct her memory with more particular observation, more exact understanding of a house and grounds which must ever be so interesting to her and all her family. She felt all the honest pride and complacency which her alliance with the present and future proprietor could fairly warrant, as she viewed the respectable size and style of the building, its suitable, becoming, characteristic situation, low and sheltered, its ample gardens stretching down to meadows washed by a stream, of which the Abbey, with all the old neglect of prospect, had scarcely a sight, and its abundance of timber in rows and avenues which neither fashion nor extravagance had rooted up. The house was larger than Hartfield, and totally unlike it, covering a good deal of ground, rambling and irregular, with many comfortable and one or two handsome rooms. It was just what it ought to be, and it looked what it was, and Emma felt an increasing respect for it as the residence of a family of such true gentility, untainted in blood and understanding. Some faults of temper John Knightley had, but Isabella had connected herself unexceptionably. She had given them neither men, nor names, nor places that could raise a blush. These were pleasant feelings, and she walked about and indulged them till it was necessary to do as the others did, and collect round the strawberry beds. The whole party were assembled, excepting Frank Churchill, who was expected every moment from Richmond, and Mrs. Elton, in all her apparatus of happiness, her large bonnet and her basket, was very ready to lead the way in gathering, accepting, or talking. Strawberries, and only strawberries, could now be thought or spoken of. The best fruit in England, everybody's favorite, always wholesome. These, the finest beds and finest sorts, delightful to gather for oneself, the only way of really enjoying them. Morning decidedly the best time. Never tired. Every sort good. Hautboy infinitely superior. No comparison. The others hardly eatable. Hautboys very scarce. Chili preferred. White wood, finest flavor of all. Price of strawberries in London. Abundance about Bristol. Maple Grove. Cultivation. Beds when to be renewed. Gardeners thinking exactly different. No general rule. Gardeners never to be put out of their way. Delicious fruit. Only too rich to be eaten much of. Inferior to cherries. Currants more refreshing. Only objection to gathering strawberries, the stooping, glaring sun. Tired to death. Could bear it no longer. Must go and sit in the shade. Such, for half an hour, was the conversation, interrupted only once by Mrs. Weston, who came out in her solicitude after her son-in-law to inquire if he were come, and she was a little uneasy. She had some fears of his horse. Seats tolerably in the shade were found, and now Emma was obliged to overhear what Mrs. Elton and Jane Fairfax were talking of. The situation, a most desirable situation, was in question. Mrs. Elton had received notice of it that morning and was in raptures. It was not with Mrs. Suckling, it was not with Mrs. Bragg, but in felicity and splendor it fell short only of them. It was with a cousin of Mrs. Bragg, an acquaintance of Mrs. Suckling, a lady known at Maple Grove. Delightful, charming, superior, first circles, spheres, lines, ranks, everything, and Mrs. Elton was wild to have the offer closed with immediately. On her side, all was warmth, energy, and triumph, and she positively refused to take her friend's negative, though Miss Fairfax continued to assure her that she would not at present engage in anything, repeating the same motives which she had been heard to urge before. Still, Mrs. Elton insisted on being authorized to write in acquiescence by the morrow's post. How Jane could bear it at all was astonishing to Emma. She did look vexed, she did speak pointedly, and at last, with a decision of action unusual to her, proposed a removal. Should not they walk? Would not Mr. Knightley show them the gardens, all the gardens? She wished to see the whole extent. The pertinacity of her friend seemed more than she could bear. It was hot, and after walking some time over the gardens in a scattered, dispersed way, scarcely any three together, they insensibly followed one another to the delicious shade of a broad, short avenue of limes, which, stretching beyond the garden at an equal distance from the river, seemed the finish of the pleasure grounds. It led to nothing but a view at the end over a low stone wall with high pillars, which seemed intended, in their erection, to give the appearance of an approach to the house, which never had been there. Disputable, however, as might be the taste of such a termination, it was in itself a charming walk, and the view which closed it extremely pretty. The considerable slope, at nearly the foot of which the abbey stood, gradually acquired a steeper form beyond its grounds, and at half a mile distant was a bank of considerable abruptness and grandeur, well clothed with wood, and at the bottom of this bank, favorably placed and sheltered, rose the Abbey Mill farm, with meadows in front, and the river making a close and handsome curve around it. It was a sweet view, sweet to the eye and the mind. English verdure, English culture, English comfort, seen under a sun bright without being oppressive. In this walk, Emma and Mr. Weston found all the others assembled, and towards this view she immediately perceived Mr. Knightley and Harriet distinct from the rest, quietly leading the way. Mr. Knightley and Harriet! It was an odd tete-a-tete, but she was glad to see it. There had been a time when he would have scorned her as a companion and turned from her with little ceremony. Now they seemed in pleasant conversation. There had been a time also when Emma would have been sorry to see Harriet in a spot so favorable for the Abbey Mill farm. But now she feared it not. It might be safely viewed with all its appendages of prosperity and beauty, its rich pastures, spreading flocks, orchard in blossom, and light column of smoke ascending. She joined them at the wall and found them more engaged in talking than in looking around. He was giving Harriet information as to modes of agriculture, etc., and Emma received a smile which seemed to say, "These are my own concerns. I have a right to talk on such subjects without being suspected of introducing Robert Martin." She did not suspect him. It was too old a story. Robert Martin had probably ceased to think of Harriet. They took a few turns together along the walk. The shade was most refreshing, and Emma found it the pleasantest part of the day. The next remove was to the house. They must all go in and eat, and they were all seated and busy, and still Frank Churchill did not come. Mrs. Weston looked and looked in vain. His father would not own himself uneasy and laughed at her fears, but she could not be cured of wishing that he would part with his black mare. He had expressed himself as to coming with more than common certainty. His aunt was so much better that he had not a doubt of getting over to them. Mrs. Churchill's state, however, as many were ready to remind her, was liable to such sudden variation as might disappoint her nephew in the most reasonable dependence, and Mrs. Weston was at last persuaded to believe, or to say, that it must be by some attack of Mrs. Churchill that he was prevented coming. Emma looked at Harriet while the point was under consideration. She behaved very well and betrayed no emotion. The cold repast was over, and the party were to go out once more to see what had not yet been seen. The old Abbey fish ponds, perhaps get as far as the clover, which was to be begun cutting on the morrow, or at any rate have the pleasure of being hot and growing cool again. Mr. Woodhouse, who had already taken his little round in the highest part of the gardens, where no damps from the river were imagined even by him, stirred no more, and his daughter resolved to remain with him, that Mrs. Weston might be persuaded away by her husband to the exercise and variety which her spirits seemed to need. Mr. Knightley had done all in his power for Mr. Woodhouse's entertainment. Books of engravings, drawers of medals, cameos, corals, shells, and every other family collection within his cabinets had been prepared for his old friend to while away the morning, and the kindness had been perfectly answered. Mr. Woodhouse had been exceedingly well amused. Mrs. Weston had been showing them all to him, and now he would show them all to Emma. Fortunate in having no other resemblance to a child than in a total want of taste for what he saw, for he was slow, constant, and methodical. Before this second looking over was begun, however, Emma walked into the hall for the sake of a few moments' free observation of the entrance and ground plot of the house, and was hardly there when Jane Fairfax appeared, coming quickly in from the garden and with a look of escape. Little expecting to meet Miss Woodhouse so soon, there was a start at first, but Miss Woodhouse was the very person she was in quest of. "Will you be so kind," said she, "when I am missed, as to say that I am gone home? I am going this moment. My aunt is not aware how late it is, nor how long we have been absent, but I am sure we shall be wanted, and I am determined to go directly. I have said nothing about it to anybody. It would only be giving trouble and distress. Some are gone to the ponds, and some to the lime walk. Till they all come in, I shall not be missed, and when they do, will you have the goodness to say that I am gone? Certainly, if you wish it. But you are not going to walk to Highbury alone? Yes, what should hurt me? I walk fast. I shall be at home in 20 minutes. But it is too far, indeed it is, to be walking quite alone. Let my father's servant go with you. Let me order the carriage. It can be round in 5 minutes. Thank you, but on no account. I would rather walk, and for me to be afraid of walking alone, I, who may soon have to guard others. She spoke with great agitation, and Emma very feelingly replied, That can be no reason for your being exposed to danger now. I must order the carriage. The heat even would be danger. You are fatigued already. I am, she answered. I am fatigued, but it is not the sort of fatigue. Quick walking will refresh me. Miss Woodhouse, we all know at times what it is to be wearied in spirits. Mine, I confess, are exhausted. The greatest kindness you can show me will be to let me have my own way and only say that I am gone when it is necessary. Emma had not another word to oppose. She saw it all, and entering into her feelings, promoted her quitting the house immediately and watched her safely off with the zeal of a friend. Her parting look was grateful, and her parting words, "Oh, Miss Woodhouse, the comfort of being alone sometimes," of being sometimes alone, seemed to burst from an overcharged heart, and to describe somewhat of the continual endurance to be practiced by her, even towards some of those who loved her best. Such a home indeed, such an aunt, said Emma as she turned back into the hall again. I do pity you, and the more sensibility you betray of their just horrors, the more I shall like you. Jane had not been gone a quarter of an hour, and they had only accomplished some views of St. Mark's Place, Venice, when Frank Churchill entered the room. Emma had not been thinking of him. She had forgotten to think of him, but she was very glad to see him. Mrs. Weston would be at ease. The black mare was blameless. They were right who had named Mrs. Churchill as the cause. He had been detained by a temporary increase of illness in her, a nervous seizure which had lasted some hours, and he had quite given up every thought of coming till very late. And had he known how hot a ride he should have, and how late, with all his hurry he must be, he believed he should not have come at all. The heat was excessive. He had never suffered anything like it. Almost wished he had stayed at home. Nothing killed him like heat. He could bear any degree of cold, etc., but heat was intolerable. And he sat down, at the greatest possible difference from the slight remains of Mr. Woodhouse's fire, looking very deplorable. You will soon be cooler if you sit still, said Emma. As soon as I am cooler, I shall go back again. I could very ill be spared, but such a point had been made of my coming. You will all be going soon, I suppose, the whole party breaking up. I met one as I came. Madness in such weather. Absolute madness. Emma listened and looked, and soon perceived that Frank Churchill's state might be best defined by the expressive phrase of being out of humor. Some people were always cross when they were hot. Such might be his constitution, and as she knew that eating and drinking were often the cure of such incidental complaints, she recommended his taking some refreshment. He would find abundance of everything in the dining room, and she humanely pointed out the door. No, he should not eat. He was not hungry. It would only make him hotter. In 2 minutes, however, he relented in his own favor, and muttering something about spruce beer, walked off. Emma returned all her attention to her father, saying in secret, I am glad I have done being in love with him. I should not like a man who is so soon discomposed by a hot morning. Harriet's sweet, easy temper will not mind it. He was gone long enough to have had a very comfortable meal, and came back all the better, grown quite cool, and with good manners, like himself, able to draw a chair close to them, take an interest in their employment, and regret, in a reasonable way, that he should be so late. He was not in his best spirits, but seemed trying to improve them, and, at last, made himself talk nonsense very agreeably. They were looking over views in Switzerland. As soon as my aunt gets well, I shall go abroad, said he. I shall never be easy till I have seen some of these places. You will have my sketches sometime or other to look at, or my tour to read, or my poem. I shall do something to expose myself. That may be, but not by sketches in Switzerland. You will never go to Switzerland. Your uncle and aunt will never allow you to leave England. They may be induced to go too. A warm climate may be prescribed for her. I have more than half an expectation of our all going abroad. I assure you I have. I feel a strong persuasion this morning that I shall soon be abroad. I ought to travel. I am tired of doing nothing. I want a change. I am serious, Miss Woodhouse, whatever your penetrating eyes may fancy. I am sick of England and would leave it tomorrow if I could. You are sick of prosperity and indulgence. Cannot you invent a few hardships for yourself and be contented to stay? I, sick of prosperity and indulgence? You are quite mistaken. I do not look upon myself as either prosperous or indulged. I am thwarted in everything material. I do not consider myself at all a fortunate person. You are not quite so miserable, though, as when you first came. Go and eat and drink a little more, and you will do very well. Another slice of cold meat, another draught of Madeira and water will make you nearly on a par with the rest of us. No, I shall not stir. I shall sit by you. You are my best cure. We are going to Box Hill tomorrow. You will join us. It is not Switzerland, but it will be something for a young man so much in want of a change. You will stay and go with us? No, certainly not. I shall go home in the cool of the evening. But you may come again in the cool of tomorrow morning. No, it will not be worthwhile. If I come, I shall be cross. Then pray stay at Richmond. But if I do, I shall be crosser still. I can never bear to think of you all there without me. These are difficulties which you must settle for yourself. Choose your own degree of crossness. I shall press you no more. The rest of the party were now returning, and all were soon collected. With some, there was great joy at the sight of Frank Churchill. Others took it very composedly, but there was a very general distress and disturbance on Miss Fairfax's disappearance being explained. That it was time for everybody to go concluded the subject, and with a short final arrangement for the next day's scheme, they parted. Frank Churchill's little inclination to exclude himself increased so much that his last words to Emma were, "Well, if you wish me to stay and join the party, I will." She smiled her acceptance, and nothing less than a summons from Richmond was to take him back before the following evening. And now for Chapter 7 of our story, or Chapter 43 of Emma. They had a very fine day for Box Hill, and all the other outward circumstances of arrangement, accommodation, and punctuality were in favor of a pleasant party. Mr. Weston directed the whole, officiating safely between Hartfield and the vicarage, and everybody was in good time. Emma and Harriet went together, Miss Bates and her niece with the Eltons, the gentleman on horseback. Mrs. Weston remained with Mr. Woodhouse. Nothing was wanting but to be happy when they got there. 7 miles were traveled in expectation of enjoyment, and everybody had a burst of admiration on first arriving. But in the general amount of the day there was deficiency. There was a languor, a want of spirits, a want of union which could not be got over. They separated too much into parties. The Eltons walked together. Mr. Knightley took charge of Miss Bates and Jane, and Emma and Harriet belonged to Mr. Churchill. And Mr. Weston tried in vain to make them harmonize better. It seemed at first an accidental division, but it never materially varied. Mr. and Mrs. Elton, indeed, showed no unwillingness to mix and be as agreeable as they could, but during the whole 2 hours that were spent at the Hill, there seemed a principle of separation between the other parties, too strong for any fine prospects or any cold collation or any cheerful Mr. Weston to remove. At first, it was downright dullness to Emma. She had never seen Frank Churchill so silent and stupid. He said nothing worth hearing, nothing worth seeing, admired without intelligence, listened without knowing what she said. While he was so dull, it was no wonder that Harriet should be dull likewise, and they were both insufferable. When they all sat down, it was better, to her taste a great deal better, for Frank Churchill grew talkative and gay, making her his first object. Every distinguishing attention that could be paid was paid to her. To amuse her and be agreeable in her eyes seemed all that he cared for. And Emma, glad to be enlivened, not sorry to be flattered, was gay and easy too, and gave him all the friendly encouragement, the admission to be gallant, which she had ever given in the first and most which she had ever given in the first and most animating period of their acquaintance, but which now, in her own estimation, meant nothing, though in the judgment of most people looking on, it must have had such an appearance as no English word but flirtation could very well describe. Mr. Frank Churchill and Miss Woodhouse flirted together excessively. They were laying themselves open to that very phrase and to having it sent off in a letter to Maple Grove by one lady, to Ireland by another. Not that Emma was gay and thoughtless from any real felicity. It was rather because she felt less happy than she had expected. She laughed because she was disappointed, and though she liked him for his attentions and thought them all, whether in friendship, admiration, or playfulness, extremely judicious, they were not winning back her heart. She still intended him for her friend. "How much I'm obliged to you," said he, "for telling me to come today. If it had not been for you, I should certainly have lost all the happiness of this party. I had quite determined to go away again." "Yes, you were very cross, and I do not know what about, except that you were too late for the best strawberries. I was a kinder friend than you deserved, but you were humble. You begged hard to be commanded to come." "Don't say I was cross. I was fatigued. The heat overcame me." "It is hotter today." "Not to my feelings. I am perfectly comfortable today." "You are comfortable because you are under command." "Your command?" "Yes." "Perhaps I intended you to say so, but I meant self-command. You had, somehow or other, broken bounds yesterday, and run away from your own management. But today you are got back again, and as I cannot be always with you, it is best to believe your temper under your own command rather than mine." "It comes to the same thing. I can have no self-command without a motive. You order me, whether you speak or not, and you can be always with me. You are always with me." "Dating from 3 o'clock yesterday. My perpetual influence cannot begin earlier, or you would not have been so much out of humor before." 3 o'clock yesterday. That is your date. I thought I had seen you first in February. "Your gallantry is really unanswerable, but," lowering her voice, "nobody speaks except ourselves, and it is rather too much to be talking nonsense for the entertainment of 7 silent people." "I say nothing of which I am ashamed," replied he with lively impudence. "I saw you first in February. Let everybody on the hill hear me if they can. Let my accent swell to Mickleham on one side and Dorking on the other. I saw you first in February." And then whispering, "Our companions are excessively stupid. What shall we do to rouse them? Any nonsense will serve. They shall talk. Ladies and gentlemen, I am ordered by Miss Woodhouse, who, wherever she is, presides, to say that she desires to know what you are all thinking of." Some laughed and answered good-humoredly. Miss Bates said a great deal. Mrs. Elton swelled at the idea of Miss Woodhouse's presiding. Mr. Knightley's answer was the most distinct. "Is Miss Woodhouse sure that she would like to hear what we are all thinking of?" "Oh, no, no," cried Emma, laughing as carelessly as she could. "Upon no account in the world. It is the very last thing I would stand the brunt of just now. Let me hear anything rather than what you are all thinking of. I will not say quite all. There are 1 or 2, perhaps," glancing at Mr. Weston and Harriet, "whose thoughts I might not be afraid of knowing." "It is a sort of thing," cried Mrs. Elton emphatically, "which I should not have thought myself privileged to inquire into, though perhaps as the chaperone of the party, I never was in any circle, exploring parties, young ladies, married women." Her mutterings were chiefly to her husband, and he murmured in reply, "Very true, my love, very true. Exactly so indeed. Quite unheard of. But some ladies say anything. Better pass it off as a joke. Everybody knows what is due to you." "It will not do," whispered Frank to Emma. "They are most of them affronted. I will attack them with more address. Ladies and gentlemen, I am ordered by Miss Woodhouse to say that she waives her right of knowing exactly what you may all be thinking of, and only requires something very entertaining from each of you in a general way. Here are 7 of you, besides myself, who, she is pleased to say, am very entertaining already, and she only demands from each of you either one thing very clever, be it prose or verse, original or repeated, or 2 things moderately clever, or 3 things very dull indeed, and she engages to laugh heartily at them all. "Oh, very well," exclaimed Miss Bates. "Then I need not be uneasy. 3 things very dull indeed. That will just do for me, you know. I shall be sure to say 3 dull things as soon as ever I open my mouth, shan't I?" Looking around with the most good-humored dependence on everybody's assent. "Do not you all think I shall?" Emma could not resist. "Ah, ma'am, but there may be a difficulty. Pardon me, but you will be limited to a number, only 3 at once." Miss Bates, deceived by the mock ceremony of her manner, did not immediately catch her meaning, but when it burst on her, it could not anger, though a slight blush showed that it could pain her. "Ah, well, to be sure. Yes, I see what she means," turning to Mr. Knightley, "and I will try to hold my tongue. I must make myself very disagreeable, or she would not have said such a thing to an old friend." "I like your plan," cried Mr. Weston. Agreed. I will do my best. I am making a conundrum. How will a conundrum reckon?" "Low, I am afraid, sir, very low," answered his son, "but we shall be indulgent, especially to anyone who leads the way." No, said Emma, "it will not reckon low. A conundrum of Mr. Weston's shall clear him and his next neighbor. Come, sir, pray let me hear it." "I doubt its being very clever myself," said Mr. Weston. "It is too much a matter of fact, but here it is. What 2 letters of the alphabet are there that express perfection?" "What 2 letters express perfection? I am sure I do not know." "Ah, you will never guess. You," to Emma, "I am certain will never guess. I will tell you. M and A. Emma. Do you understand?" Understanding and gratification came together. It might be a very indifferent piece of wit, but Emma found a great deal to laugh at and enjoy in it, and so did Frank and Harriet. It did not seem to touch the rest of the party equally. Some looked very stupid about it, and Mr. Knightley gravely said, This explains the sort of clever thing that is wanted, and Mr. Weston has done very well for himself, but he must have knocked up everybody else. Perfection should not have come quite so soon." "Oh, for myself, I protest I must be excused," said Mrs. Elton. "I really cannot attempt. I am not at all fond of this sort of thing. I had an acrostic once sent to me upon my own name, which I was not at all pleased with. I knew who it came from, an abominable puppy. You know who I mean," nodding to her husband. "These kinds of things are very well at Christmas when one is sitting around the fire, but quite out of place, in my opinion, when one is exploring about the country in summer. Miss Woodhouse must excuse me. I am not one of those who have witty things at everybody's service. I do not pretend to be a wit. I have a great deal of vivacity in my own way, but I really must be allowed to judge when to speak and when to hold my tongue. Pass us, if you please, Mr. Churchill. Pass Mr. E., Knightley, Jane, and myself. We have nothing clever to say, not one of us." Yes, pray pass me," added her husband, with a sort of sneering consciousness. "I have nothing to say that can entertain Miss Woodhouse, or any other young lady. An old married man, quite good for nothing. Shall we walk, Augusta?" "With all my heart. I am really tired of exploring so long on one spot. Come, Jane, take my other arm." Jane declined it, however, and the husband and wife walked off. Happy couple, said Frank Churchill, as soon as they were out of hearing. "How well they suit one another. Very lucky, marrying as they did, upon an acquaintance formed only in a public place. They only knew each other, I think, a few weeks in Bath. Peculiarly lucky, for as to any real knowledge of a person's disposition that Bath or any public place can give, it is all nothing. There can be no knowledge. It is only by seeing women in their own homes, among their own set, just as they always are, that you can form any just judgment. Short of that, it is all guess and luck, and will generally be ill luck. How many a man has committed himself on a short acquaintance and rued it all the rest of his life." Miss Fairfax, who had seldom spoken before, except among her own confederates, spoke now. Such things do occur, undoubtedly. She was stopped by a cough. Frank Churchill turned towards her to listen. You were speaking, said he gravely. She recovered her voice. I was only going to observe that though such unfortunate circumstances do sometimes occur, both to men and women, I cannot imagine them to be very frequent. A hasty and imprudent attachment may arise, but there is generally time to recover from it afterwards. I would be understood to mean that it can be only weak, irresolute characters, whose happiness must be always at the mercy of chance, who will suffer an unfortunate acquaintance to be an inconvenience, an oppression forever. He made no answer, merely looked and bowed in submission, and soon afterwards said in a lively tone, Well, I have so little confidence in my own judgment that whenever I marry, I hope somebody will choose my wife for me. Will you, turning to Emma, will you choose a wife for me? I am sure I should like anybody fixed on by you. You provide for the family, you know, with a smile at his father. Find somebody for me. I am in no hurry. Adopt her, educate her. And make her like myself? By all means, if you can. Very well, I undertake the commission. You shall have a charming wife. She must be very lively and have hazel eyes. I care for nothing else. I shall go abroad for a couple of years, and when I return, I shall come to you for my wife. Remember. Emma was in no danger of forgetting. It was a commission to touch every favorite feeling. Would not Harriet be the very creature described? Hazel eyes excepted, 2 years more might make her all that he wished. He might even have Harriet in his thoughts at the moment. Who could say? Referring the education to her seemed to imply it. Now, ma'am, said Jane to her aunt, shall we join Mrs. Elton? If you please, my dear, with all my heart. I am quite ready. I was ready to have gone with her, but this will do just as well. We shall soon overtake her. There she is. No, that's somebody else. That's one of the ladies in the Irish car party, not at all like her. Well, I declare. They walked off, followed in half a minute by Mr. Knightley, Mr. Weston, his son, followed by Mr. Knightley. Mr. Weston, his son, Emma, and Harriet only remained, and the young man's spirits now rose to a pitch almost unpleasant. Even Emma grew tired at last of flattery and merriment, and wished herself rather walking quietly about with any of the others, or sitting almost alone and quite unattended to, in tranquil observation of the beautiful views beneath her. The appearance of the servants looking out for them to give notice of the carriage was a joyful sight, and even the bustle of collecting and preparing to depart, and the solicitude of Mrs. Elton to have her carriage first, were gladly endured in the prospect of the quiet drive home which was to close the very questionable enjoyments of this day of pleasure. Such another scheme, composed of so many ill-assorted people, she hoped never to be betrayed into again. While waiting for the carriage, she found Mr. Knightley by her side. He looked around as if to see that no one were near, and then said, Emma, I must once more speak to you as I have been used to do. A privilege rather endured than allowed, perhaps, but I must still use it. I cannot see you acting wrong without a remonstrance. How could you be so unfeeling to Miss Bates? How could you be so insolent in your wit to a woman of her character, age, and situation? Emma, I had not thought it possible. Emma recollected, blushed, was sorry, but tried to laugh it off. Nay, how could I help saying what I did? Nobody could have helped it. It was not so very bad. I dare say she did not understand me. I assure you she did. She felt your full meaning. She has talked of it since. I wish you could have heard how she talked of it, with what candor and generosity. I wish you could have heard her honoring your forbearance in being able to pay her such attentions as she was forever receiving from yourself and your father, when her society must be so irksome. Oh, cried Emma, I know there is not a better creature in the world, but you must allow that what is good and what is ridiculous are most unfortunately blended in her. They are blended, said he, I acknowledge, and were she prosperous, I could allow much for the occasional prevalence of the ridiculous over the good. Were she a woman of fortune, I would leave every harmless absurdity to take its chance. I would not quarrel with you for any liberties of manner. Were she your equal in situation? But, Emma, Consider how far this is from being the case. She is poor. She has sunk from the comforts she was born to, and if she lived to old age, must probably sink more. Her situation should secure your compassion. It was badly done indeed. You, whom she had known from an infant, whom she had seen grow up from a period when her notice was an honor, to have you now, in thoughtless spirits and the pride of the moment, laugh at her, humble her, and before her niece too, and before others, many of whom, certainly some, would be entirely guided by your treatment of her. This is not pleasant to you, Emma. It is very far from pleasant to me. But I will tell you truths while I can, satisfied with proving myself your friend by very faithful counsel, and trusting that you will sometime or other do me greater justice than you can do now. While they talked, they were advancing towards the carriage. It was ready, and before she could speak again, he had handed her in. He had misinterpreted the feelings which had kept her face averted and her tongue motionless. They were combined only of anger against herself, mortification, and deep concern. She had not been able to speak, and on entering the carriage, sunk back for a moment overcome. Then reproaching herself for having taken no leave, making no acknowledgment, parting in apparent sullenness, she looked out with voice and hand, eager to show a difference. But it was just too late. He had turned away, and the horses were in motion. She continued to look back, but in vain. And soon, with what appeared unusual speed, they were halfway down the hill, and everything left far behind. She was vexed beyond what could have been expressed, almost beyond what she could conceal. Never had she felt so agitated, mortified, grieved at any circumstance in her life. She was most forcibly struck. The truth of his representation there was no denying. She felt it at her heart. How could she have been so brutal, so cruel to Miss Bates? How could she have exposed herself to such ill opinion in anyone she valued? And how suffer him to leave her without saying one word of gratitude, of concurrence, of common kindness? Time did not compose her. As she reflected more, she seemed but to feel it more. She never had been so depressed. Happily, it was not necessary to speak. There was only Harriet, who seemed not in spirits herself, fagged and very willing to be silent, and Emma felt the tears running down her cheeks almost all the way home, without being at any trouble to check them, extraordinary as they were. Oh, on that sorry note, we conclude today's chapter. That was the chapter that I was dreading reading, because it's just, I would like to hope it is uncharacteristic of Emma to be so thoughtlessly cruel to somebody, because I think that even though she is not always correct in her actions, I think she is generally good-hearted, and that was just an uncharacteristic moment of our little character. And so let's hope Emma has better chapter tomorrow, better circumstances. And so thank you very much for joining me today. Let's always hope for a better tomorrow. Isn't that a good way to look at it? So I hope you guys have a better rest of your day and an even better tomorrow. We'll see you tomorrow for more reading. Bye, friends.